Howdy folks, and welcome to War Thunder patch 1.55 Royal Armour, following hot on the heels of War Thunder patch 1.53 Firestorm. Wait, what? What happened to 1.54? Your guess is as good as mine. Doesn't matter. 1.55 introduces, at long last, the British Ground Forces tech tree, as promised by Gaijin, before the end of the year. And that's not all. There are new vehicles, both ground and air, for various other nations. There are 2 new maps. It's not as radical a patch as 1.53, which, as well as introducing new vehicles and aircraft, also radically overhauled the game engine, introduced expanded, destructible scenery, and so on and so on. But there's still plenty to see and enjoy here in 1.55, particularly if you're a fan of British armour. What sort of British armour are we talking about? Well, they're not trying to reinvent the wheel here. As well as tanks like the Crusader, we've got the Comets and Cromwells. We've got tanks like the Challenger, which here in War Thunder is in the medium tank line, along with other tanks like, of course, the Centurion, both 20-pounder and 105mm Royal Ordnance gun-equipped variant. Then we get some oddities like the Churchill gun carrier with a 3-inch gun, which leads on to more traditional Churchills, the Mark III with a 6-pounder gun, the Mark VII with the 75mm gun. From there we branch out to the Carnarvon with a very, very nice 20-pounder gun. And the Carnarvon, of course, leads us to the top-tier British heavy tank, the Conqueror, with that 120mm gun specifically designed to eliminate IS-3s from long range. Tank destroyers, we have machines like the Valentine AT, and the unusual Valentine Archer, which actually had a gun that fired backwards over the hull of the tank. Moving up, we have the Avenger, with the 17-pounder gun, the Charioteer, with the 20-pounder gun, and, of course, where would we be without the A39 Tortoise, with its 94mm 32-pounder gun. And as far as the anti-aircraft vehicles are concerned, we have machines like the Crusader Mark 1 AA with the excellent Swedish-designed 40mm Bofors AA gun. And it's not all about the tanks. There are also 2 versions of the 4-engine short Stirling bomber built by Short Brothers of Belfast. As far as other nations are concerned, the USA gets the F-3F biplane, Japan gets 3 new aircraft, the A7M2, the liquid-cooled Ki-61, and another variant of the Ki-44. And we haven't forgotten about Germany either. The Luftwaffe gets another variant of the excellent Ju-88 medium and dive bomber. No new German ground vehicles, however, not this time. Oh, hang on a minute, what's this? Oh, there is actually a new German premium. Oh my god, they've given Germany a Churchill! What heresy is this? Next thing you know, you'll be telling me the Germans have got KV-1s, except with better guns. Actually, Jingles. Oh, bloody hell, Germany. Not content with designing the best tanks of your own, you've got to go and steal all of ours as well? The Soviets get their most advanced aircraft to date, the MiG-17. It's a very, very nice aircraft, top tier, obviously. And as far as raw speed is concerned, we give even the Hawker Hunter a good run for its money. It will struggle to reach its maximum speed in level flight, but if you put it into a shallow dive, you can almost reach 1100 km per hour before the wings start threatening to get ripped off the airframe. This is a very, very quick aircraft. There's also a new premium T-44. What's special about that? Well, it's got a 122mm gun. But enough about all this foreign nonsense. What are the British tanks like? Well, I can't tell you what all the British tanks are like because they've only just come out, and unless you're prepared to drop £100 worth of gold on the game and convert a whole bunch of experience into unlocking all the tanks the day they're released, which I'm sure some people have done, but which I am not prepared to do. I can at least tell you what my experience... Oop, there's the old arcade battle physics in action again. I'd forgotten what that was like. I must remember to understeer. Anyway, this is my 100% stock, fresh out of the factory, Mark II Crusader cruiser tank. It's 100% unupgraded. If the tank gets immobilised, it's going to stay immobilised because I haven't researched spare parts yet. If I get set on fire, we're going to burn to death because I haven't researched the fire extinguisher. And by a massive stroke of luck, this is my very first game in a non-premium British tank, and in fact probably my very first game of War Thunder Ground Forces in about a month. I managed to get one of the 2 new maps that's also been released in patch 1.55. This is the map representing the Second Battle of El Alamein. A battle in the North African deserts of 1942 which saw extensive use of British and American armour against the forces of Italy and the German Afrika Korps. Coincidentally, tanks exactly like the Crusader. Crusader armed with the 2-pounder gun, which was a very, very good anti-tank gun. At least it was in 1942. It was perfectly capable of penetrating the armour of Panzer IIs, Panzer IIIs, Panzer IVs, would have been completely inadequate against the Tiger, of course. And the Tigers did see action in North Africa in 1942, although not in time for the Second Battle of El Alamein, which was over by the 11th of November. Tigers first saw action on the 5th of December in the Tunisian campaign. Actually, Jingles, the Tiger tank first saw combat even earlier than that, during September 1942 in the Battle for Leningrad. Yes, I'm talking about in the western desert of North Africa. Please do pay attention. Anyway, where were we? Oh yes, the Crusader. And that 2-pounder gun, which in 1941 was a very, very good anti-tank gun. However, by 1942, the Crusaders were facing German tanks that had improved armour, later versions of the Panzer III and early versions of the Panzer IV, and the 2-pounder shell tended to shatter on impact rather than penetrate. Still, managed to get through the front of this Stug 3 without too many problems, as long as I just look for the right spot, and it is a very accurate gun. British crews, unlike German tank crews, were trained to fire on the move, which did mean that they didn't get an awful lot of first shot hits on target. Interestingly, the gun cradle, or the breech of the gun if you like, actually rested on the gunner's shoulder. It was almost like firing a bazooka inside a tank turret. Of course, because the Crusader was such a small tank, and by 1942 it was facing tanks that the 2-pounder gun was mostly inadequate against, efforts were made to upgrade the gun. And so the Crusader Mark III was equipped with a 6-pounder gun, which is 57mm, as opposed to the 40mm 2-pounder. The problem was, of course, that because the Crusader is such a small tank, with such a small turret ring, there was a limit to exactly how big a gun you could fit to this machine, and so the 6-pounder was pretty much as big as it got on the Crusader Mark III, which is the tank that the Mark II Crusader here leads onto. The Crusader didn't actually do too well during the North African campaigns, and this was due to a number of reasons. The age of the tank. By 1942, the tank really was rapidly approaching its sell-by date. There was a limited number of ways it could be upgraded. It wasn't particularly mechanically reliable, which, as I'm sure you can imagine, when you're fighting a desert campaign, is fairly important. More on that in a moment. As we've already seen, its firepower was starting to prove inadequate, although that would be addressed with the addition of the 6-pounder gun in the Mark III Crusader. But also British tactics didn't really help. British tactics during the North African campaign, even during the Second Battle of El Alamein, were pretty much just a case of throw enough shit at the wall and some of it's gonna stick. During Operation Crusader, the Crusader tank squadrons were not really deployed in a way where they could support each other. This wasn't considered to be a problem because the British still outnumbered the German tank forces by a considerable margin, but unfortunately they were fighting against Rommel. And Rommel was no idiot, so he didn't commit his tanks against the British tanks, instead preferring to rely on very well-sighted anti-tank guns in combination with infantry. And so when the Crusaders squadrons ran into these concealed anti-tank gun positions protected by infantry, they ran into the biggest problem associated with this tank when it wasn't shooting at other tanks. It had completely inadequate high explosive shells. 2 pounds of high explosive was just not enough to deal with a well-defended anti-tank gun position. And German anti-tank guns at the time had absolutely no problems defeating the flimsy armour of this tank. Even the Crusader Mark II, which was an up-armoured version of the Crusader Mark I, the armour was still terrible. There were a couple of design features of the tank that didn't help the situation either. If you look at the turret there, you see the angled sides. That's actually spaced armour on the side of the turret. But if a shot was to hit on the side of the turret underneath that cosmetic armour, if you like, on the sides of the turret, it had a nasty habit of forming a shot trap, and so the shot would actually lift the turret clean off the tank, with, I'm sure you can imagine, disastrous consequences for the crew. The Crusader also had a nasty tendency to brew up or burn when it was hit, and this was due to a problem also associated with early versions of the M4 Sherman. It didn't have protected ammunition racks, and hot shrapnel going into the ammunition, yeah, not good. Mechanically, the tanks were about as reliable as most other British tanks at the time, which is to say, not very reliable at all, and when you consider the huge distances involved in the fighting that took place in the North African deserts of 1941 and 1942, this posed a considerable strain upon not just the tanks themselves, that had to cross those distances on their own tracks and suffered enormous wear and tear, but also on the supply train, because the British were winning and forcing the Germans back. Their logistics lines were getting longer and longer and longer, and the Germans were getting shorter and shorter and shorter. Much more reliable American tanks like the M3 Grant, which arrived in 1942, replaced 1 in 3 of the Crusader squadrons, and later the same happened with the M4 Sherman. Bizarrely, for whatever reason, when the British First Army landed in French Tunisia for the Battle of Tunisia between November 1942 and May 1943, they actually deployed their Crusader tanks in mixed squadrons with Ballantine II tanks. Now, the Ballantine II was an infantry tank, The Crusader was a cruiser tank. The only advantage that the Crusader had over the kind of German armour that it was going to be facing was its speed, which was completely negated by deploying them in mixed squadrons with Valentine infantry tanks. The First Army didn't hang on to its Crusaders for very long, however. In fact, it actually replaced them with M4 Shermans before the end of the Battle of Tunisia. By the end of the campaign in North Africa, the Crusader's days as a frontline fighting tank were long over. It was relegated to secondary duties, towing 17-pounder guns as a gun tractor, and converted to anti-aircraft carriages, one of which is available in War Thunder patch 1.55. Even converted to a firing platform for the very, very good Swedish-designed Bofors 40mm anti-aircraft gun, it didn't see a whole lot of operational use. Designed for operations in northwest Europe, the Allies had such massive air superiority over the Luftwaffe that there just wasn't anything for the Crusader AA gun to shoot at, and so, even before the end of the war, the Crusader anti-aircraft squadrons were disbanded, and instead the Crusader saw the war out, certainly in British use, as a gun tractor for 17-pounder anti-tank guns. A number of Crusaders survive today, some in working condition, such as the Mark III Crusader, which regularly runs out during Tankfest at the Bollington Tank Museum. There's a French museum, whose name I cannot pronounce, which has a working Mark III anti-aircraft Crusader, and the Dutch Overloon War Museum also has a Crusader gun tractor. Other than that, they mostly exist as wrecks. As far as the Crusader's concerned in War Thunder, I have to admit I was not expecting to like this tank. War Thunder is... okay, it has its issues, but it's one of the more realistic of the tank simulators out there. And the Crusader has absolutely no armour, was mechanically unreliable, was prone to burning when it was hit. And so I wasn't expecting to have a particularly good time in this tank, and I realise this is an arcade battle, so it's even less realistic than you would imagine. But despite the fact that I lost a crew member on I think the first hit that the tank took, the Crusader did perform reasonably well. Remember, this tank is, at the moment, completely unupgraded. This was the first time I'd taken it into battle. I hadn't dropped any gold on unlocking equipment modifications before I took it into battle, and yet it seemed to do all right. I have been speaking to various experts, and it does seem that it's not without its issues. Apparently the 2-pounder gun is not quite as accurate as it should be, although I didn't experience any issues with it. Providing I stopped and aimed, I didn't really experience any problems with hitting whatever I was pointing the gun at. Then again, that could just be down to the fact that I am actually playing an arcade battle here. It's entirely possible that the differences are much more pronounced, and in fact entirely probable that the differences are much more pronounced in realistic and simulator battle, but I haven't tried those two game modes just yet. Now, I don't normally actually enjoy War Thunder Arcade all that much, particularly War Thunder Arcade ground battles, and yet I did really enjoy this game. The thing is, the Crusader is definitely not the kind of tank that can carry a donkey team. It just doesn't have the armour, it cannot take the hits. And I do realise that my enjoyment of this battle in particular here on the Eleanor Mine map was largely down to the fact that I had a team that was capable of telling the difference between its own arse and its elbow. So, most of the time when I'm shooting at an enemy tank, I'm not the only one shooting at them, and I'm not therefore going to be the only friendly tank taking return fire, except in one, possibly two different occasions during the course of this battle. Remember, never underestimate the value of teamwork. If nothing else, it gives the enemy something else to shoot at other than you. And I realise that this is the only reason I did manage to actually survive this match without having to switch to a second vehicle. I had the Crusader Mark III queued up, but I never got the opportunity to use it because I just never died during the course of this particular arcade battle. As far as the results were concerned, well, I did all right. Certainly nothing to shout about, finished 4th on the team, but the team did pretty well overall. And that one battle was enough for me to unlock all of the Tier 1 upgrades on the Crusader Mark II and almost all 3/4 of the Tier 2 upgrades on the Crusader Mark II. So I won't have to take it into battle completely stock again, even though it didn't do too badly for a completely stock tank. Now, while I do think 1.55 is a pretty good patch, it's not entirely without its issues. The following information, by the way, I can't take any credit for. I've been approached by a historian called Davis Kyle, who has pointed out a couple of errors. Apparently, and I can't really verify this because despite an intensive search around the internet, I haven't actually been able to come up with a diagram showing the crew positions on the Churchill series of tanks, but apparently Gaijin's gotten it wrong. There are other issues, most notably to do with weapons and armour thickness, which I'm sure you can imagine in a tank game is significantly more important, and we're talking here about the Conqueror. The turret armour at the front of the Conqueror is listed as being 152mm thick. Now, this is what Wikipedia says, 7 inches. Unfortunately, the information on Wikipedia comes from one document supplied by the Bovington Tank Museum's archives, which has been proven as wrong. Most other sources state that the armour was 10 inches thick, not 7. You'd think it would be a relatively simple process to actually determine how thick the turret armour is on this tank. I mean, they've got one at the Bovington Tank Museum after all, and yet it turns out that due to the shape of the turret, it's actually remarkably resistant to ultrasonic probing. So the documentation is all we have to go on, and most of the documentation says the armour should be 10 inches thick, not 7. Also, and this is a comparatively minor issue, the Conqueror doesn't have the actual battle armour packs installed on it that it would have had, they look like this, if it was ever actually going to go into battle. And I say that this is a comparatively minor issue because if War Thunder isn't modelling these extra armour packs, well, they're not the first people to not model these extra armour packs. World of Tanks doesn't do it either. However, consider that the Conqueror was designed to go into battle against IS-3s, and there's no better tank in the British armour line here in War Thunder, and it's going to be going into battle against T-10s and IS-4s, so that extra armour would definitely be appreciated. What's of significantly more concern, however, is, well, it's to do with the main gun on the Conqueror. That is the Royal Ordnance L11 120mm rifled tank main armament. And it's a very, very good gun. On the Chieftain and the Challenger 1, I mean, the Conqueror's not supposed to have this gun. The Conqueror had the Royal Ordnance 120mm rifled L1A1 gun. Not this thing. So I can't even begin to explain how they've managed to get this wrong, but they have. Or who knows, perhaps they've thought, okay, it's the Conqueror, designed to fight IS-3s, but it's going to be going up against IS-4s and T-10s, so perhaps we better give it a better gun. Well, don't give us a better gun, give us a better tank. Give us the Chieftain. Well, I don't know, you come up with a better explanation. Regardless, wrong gun on this tank. All of that aside, however, it is nice to see the British tanks in War Thunder at last. And there were no real surprises here. We've got the Cromwells, we've got the Comets, we've got the Crusaders, we've got the Churchills, we've got the Conqueror, we've got the Centurions. Pretty much exactly what everybody expected to see. And there are one or two oddities, like the Churchill 3-inch gun carrier, for example. But then again, we've already seen the Churchill gun carrier, although it has a significantly bigger gun, in World of Tanks. So no real surprises in the lineup of the Royal Armour in War Thunder patch 1.55. I'm just glad they're here at last. And hopefully you guys are going to enjoy playing them too. That's it for today, folks. As always, take care, and I'll catch you next time.